Today I'm going to read Xanth, Book 2, the Source of Magic. It's going to be a fun one. I'm probably going to make a lot of mistakes, so be warned. And see you soon. Xanth, Book 2, Chapter 1, The Closet Skeleton. The magic sniffer ambled towards Bink, its long limber snout snuffling industriously. When the creature reached him, it went out into a frenzy of enthusiasm, snorting out flute-like notes, waggling its bushy tail and prancing in a circle. "Sure, I like you too, Sniffler," said Bink, squatting to embrace it. The creature's snout kissed his nose wetly. "You were one of the first to believe in my magic when—" Bink paused, for the creature was acting strangely. It had stopped frisking and become subdued, almost frightened. "What's the matter, little friend?" Bink asked, concerned. "Did I say something to hurt your feelings? I apologise." But the sniffler curled its tail between its legs and slunk away. Bink stared after it, chagrined. It was almost as if the magic had been turned off, causing the thing to lose its function. But Bink's talent, like all others, was inherent. It couldn't dissipate while he lived. Something else must have frightened the sniffler. Bink looked about, feeling uneasy. To his east was the Castle Rugna orchard, whose trees bore all manner of exotic fruit, vegetables, and sundry artifacts like cherry bombs and doorknobs. To the south was the untamed wilds of Xanth. Bink remembered how that jungle had herded him and his companions here, seeming so menacing way back then. Today the trees were basically friendly. They'd only wanted a magician to stay in the Castle Rugna great again. They'd only wanted a magician to stay and make the Castle Rugna great again. King Trent had done just that. Now the considerable power of the region exerted itself for the benefit of the kingdom. Everything seemed to be in order. Well, on with his business. There was to be a ball tonight, and his shoes were badly worn. He proceeded to the edge of the orchard, where a stray shoe tree had rooted. Shoes liked to move about, and often planted themselves in out-of-the-way places. This one had several ripe shoes. Bink inspected individual ones without plucking them, until he was sure he'd found a pair that fit him. Then he twisted it off, shook out the seeds, and put them carefully on his feet. They were quite comfortable, and looked nice because they were fresh. He started back, walking with exaggerated motion so as to break the shoes in without scuffing them. His mind still nagged by the episode of the magic sniffer. Was it an omen? Omens always came true, here in the land of Xanth, but it was seldom possible to understand them properly until too late. Was something bad going to happen to him? That really seemed unlikely. Bink knew it was no exaggeration to assume that serious evil would not fall on all Xanth before Bink himself was harmed. So it must be a misreading. The magic sniffer had merely suffered a fit of indigestion and had to scoot off. Soon Bink was within sight of home. It was a fine cottage, geez. Sorry, the joke got me. Just off the palace grounds, which he had moved into when he married. The rind had long since hardened and lost the better part of its flavour. The walls were fine-grained, creamy yellow petrified cheese. It was one of those most tasteful cottages. It was one of the most tasteful cottages. Say again. It was one of the most tasteful cottages extant. As you do. But since he hadn't hollowed it out himself, he didn't seem fit to brag about it. Bink took a deep breath, nerved himself, and opened the front rind door. A sweetish waft of seasoned cheese blew out, together with a raucous screech. "That you, Bink? 'Bout time! Where did you sneak off to? Right when there's work to be done! You have no consideration at all, do you? I need shoes!" I need shoes, he said shortly. "Shoes!" she exclaimed incredulously. "You have shoes, idiot!" His wife was much smarter than he. At the moment, for chameleons, intelligence varied with time of the month, as did her appearance. When she was beautiful, she was stupid, in the extreme for both. When she was smart, she was ugly. Very smart, very ugly. At the moment, she was at the height of that latter phase. This was one reason she was keeping herself secluded, virtually locked in her room. "I need good-looking ones tonight," he said, mustering patience. But even as the words were out, he realized he had phrased it badly. Any reference to good looks set her off. "The hell you do, dunce!" He wished she hadn't kept rubbing in his inferior intelligence. Ordinarily, she was smart enough not to do that. Bink knew he was no genius, but he wasn't subnormal either. She was the one who was both. Who's this talking now? "I have to attend the anniversary ball," he said, explaining, though of course she already knew that. "It would be an insult to the Queen if I attended it sloppily dressed." "Don't!" she screamed from her hideaway. "You're attending in costume. No one will see your stinking shoes." Oops, that was right. He'd made his trip for nothing. "But it's all too typical of your selfishness," she continued with righteous ire. "Bugging off to the party to have a good time while I suffer at home alone, chewing the walls." This was literal, of course. The cheese was old and hard, but she gnawed on it when she got angry. And she was angry most of the time now. Still, he tried to be positive. He'd only been married a year, and he'd loved Chameleon. He had known at the outset that there would be good times and bad, and this was a bad time. A very bad time. "Why don't you come to the ball too, dear?" "Me?" she exploded with cynical wrath. "When I look like this? Spare me your feeble-minded sarcasm." "But as you reminded me, it's a costume party. The Queen is cloaking every attendee in disguise of her choosing, so no one else will see." "You utter moronic nincompoop!" she bawled through the wall as he heard something crash. Now she was throwing things in a genuine temper tantrum. "How can I go to a party in any disguise when I'm 9 months pregnant?" And that was what was really bothering her. Not her normal smart ugly phase that she'd lived all her life, but the enormous discomfort and restriction of her pregnancy. Bink had precipitated that condition during their lovely phase, only to learn when she got smarter that she had not wanted such commitment at this time. She feared her baby would look like her, or like him. She'd wanted to find some spell to ensure the child would be positively talented, or at least normal, and now it was up to blind chance. She'd accepted the situation with extremely poor grace, and had not forgiven him. The smarter she got, the more pregnant she got, and the more intense her ire became. Well, soon she would be over the hump and getting prettier, just in time for the baby. It was due in a week or so. Maybe the baby would be normal, perhaps even strongly talented, and Chameleon's fears would be laid to rest. And then she would stop taking him out on it. Then she would stop taking it out on him. If, however, the baby were abnormal, but best not think about that. "Sorry, I forgot," he mumbled. "You forgot!" The irony of her tone cut through his sensitivities like a magic sword through a cheese of the cottage. "Imbecile! You'd like to forget, wouldn't you? Why didn't you think of that last year when you—" "I've got to go, Chameleon," he muttered, hastily retreating out the door. "The Queen gets upset when people are tardy." In fact, it seemed to be the nature of women to get upset with men, and to throw tantrums. That was one of the things that distinguished them from nymphs. That was one of the things that distinguished them from nymphs, who looked like women, but were always amenable to the idle whims of men. He supposed he should count himself lucky that his wife didn't have a dangerous talent, like setting fire to people or generating thunderstorms. Why does the Queen have to throw her ridiculous, pointless, dull party now? Chameleon demanded, right when she knows I can't attend. Ah, the logic of women. Why bother to try and understand it? All the intelligence of the land of Xanth couldn't make sense of the senseless. Bink closed the door behind him. Actually, Chameleon's question had been rhetorical. They both knew the answer. Queen Iris took every opportunity to flaunt her status, and this was the first anniversary of that status. Theoretically, the ball was in honour of the king. Actually, King Trent cared little for theatrics, and would probably skip the festivities. The party was really for the Queen. Though she couldn't compel the king to attend, woe betide the lesser functionary who played hooky tonight. Bink was such a functionary. And why was this so? He asked himself as he trod glumly on. He was supposed to be an important person, the royal researcher of Xanth, whose duty it was to probe the mysteries of magic and report directly to the king. But with Chameleon's pregnancy and the necessary organisation of the homestead, Bink had not gotten around to any real research. For that, he had only himself to blame, really. He should indeed have considered the consequences of impregnating his wife. At the time, fatherhood had been the last thing on his mind. But Chameleon Lovely was a figure to cloud a man's mind and excite his... well, never mind. Ah, nostalgia. Back when love was new, carefree and uncomplicated, without responsibility. Chameleon Lovely was very like a nymph. No, that was a false feeling. His life before he met Chameleon had not been all that simple, and he had encountered her 3 times before recognising her. He had feared he had no magic talent. He shimmered, and suddenly his appearance changed. The Queen's costume had arrived. Bink was the same person, mentally, physically, but now he looked like a centaur. The Queen's illusion, so he could play the game she had devised, in her infinite capacity to generate minor mischief. Each person had to guess the identities of as many other people before making their way to the palace ballroom, and there was a prize for the one who guessed the most correctly. In addition, she had set up a mock maze hedge around Castle Rugna. Even if he did not play the people guessing game, he would be forced to thread his way through the giant puzzle. Damn the Queen! But he had to go through it, as did everyone else. The king wisely did not interfere with household matters and gave the Queen considerable play with her talent. With resignation, Bink entered the maze and began the laborious chore of threading his way through the network of false paths towards the castle. Most of the hedge was an illusion, but enough of it anchored in reality to make it safest simply to honour the maze, rather than barging through. I am just terrible. The Queen would have her fun, especially on this important first anniversary of the king's coronation. She could get uglier than Chameleon when not humoured. Bink whipped round a corner and almost collided with a zombie. The thing's wormy face dripping with earth and goo. The great square eye sockets were windows of petrification. The smell was appalling. Morbidly fascinated, Bink stared into the eyes. Far within their depths there seemed to be a familiar illumination, as of moonlight on a haunted plain, or glow fungus feeding on the corpse's rotting brain. It was as if he could see through twin tunnels into the very source of its foul animation, and perhaps to the root of the magic of all Xanth. Yet it was nightmare. For the zombie was one of the living dead, a horror that should be quickly buried and forgotten. Why had this one ripped free of its unquiet grave? The zombies normally roused themselves only in defence of Castle Rugna, and they had been impassive since the King Trent took over. The zombie stepped towards him, opening its fossil mouth. "Vroom," it said, labouring to make the putrid gas that was its only breath form a word. Bink backed away, sickened. He feared little in the land of Xanth for his physical prowess and magic talent, made him one of the most subtly formidable people in the kingdom. But the peculiar discomfort and disgust entailed in dealing with a zombie unnerved him. He spun about and ran down the side avenue, leaving the undead thing behind with its decaying articulation. With its decaying articulation of bones and mouldy flesh, it could not match his speed, and didn't even try. Suddenly, a gleaming sword rose up before him. Bink halted, amazed by this second apparition. He saw no person, no connections, just the weapon. Was this the purpose of this illusion? What was the purpose of this illusion? Oh, it must be a cute little trick of the Queen's. She liked to make her parties exciting and challenging. All he had to do was walk through the sword, calling its bluff. Yet he hesitated. The blade looked terribly real. Bink remembered his experience with Jama as a youth. Jama's talent was manifesting flying swords. Solid, sharp, dangerous. For a few seconds they existed. And he tended to exert his talent arrogantly. Jama was no friend of Bink's, and if he were in the area, Bink drew his own sword. "En garde!" he exclaimed, and struck the other weapon, half expecting the blade to pass through without resistance. The Queen would be pleased her bluff had worked, and this way he was taking no risk, just in case. But the other sword was solid. Steel clanged on steel, and then the other weapon twisted about to disengage from his, thrust swiftly in his chest. Bink parried and stepped aside. This was no temporary blade, no mindless flying thing. Some invisible hand guided it, and that meant an invisible man. The sword struck again, and again Bink parried. This thing was trying to get him, really trying to get him. "Who are you?" Bink demanded, but there was no answer. Bink had been practicing with the sword the past year, and his tutor claimed that he had an apt... Bink had been practicing with a sword for the past year, and his tutor claimed that he was an apt student. Bink had courage, speed, ample physical power. He knew he was hardly an expert yet, but he was no longer an amateur. He rather enjoyed the challenge, even with an invisible opponent. But a serious fight was something else. Why was he being attacked on this festive occasion? Who was his silent, secretive enemy? Bink was lucky that the person's spell invisibility had not affected the sword itself, and then he would have an awful time countering it. But every item of magic in xanth was single. A sword could not carry its necessary charms of sharpening and hardness, and also be invisible. Well, it was possible for anything to be possible. Oh no, that's how they've written it. It was possible for anything to be possible. But it was highly unlikely. At any rate, the weapon was all Bink needed to see. "Halt!" he cried. "Desist, or I must counter you." Again, the enemy sword slashed at him ferociously. Bink was already aware he had faced no expert. The swordsman's style was more bold than skilled. Bink blocked the weapon off, then countered with a half-hearted thrust at his opponent's exposed midsection. There was only one place the midsection could be, visible or not. For certain, a balance and position were essential in swordplay. Bink's strike was not hard enough to maim, but sufficient to... The blade passed right through the invisible torso without resistance. There was nothing there. Bink, startled, lost his concentration and balance. The enemy sword thrust at his face. He ducked barely in time. His instructor Crombie, the soldier, had taught him such avoidance, but this escape was at least partly luck. Without his talent, he could have been dead. Bink didn't like to depend on his talent. That was the point of learning swordsmanship, to defend himself on his own way, openly, with pride, without suffering the private snickers of those who assumed, naturally enough, that mere chance had helped him. His magic might stop a blunt attack by having the attacker slip on a littered fruit rind. It didn't care about his pride. But when he won fairly with a sword, no one laughed. No one laughed now, but he still didn't like being attacked by, something. It was one of the magic weapons of... It must be one of the magic weapons of the king's private arsenal, and it was consciously directed. No way this could be the action of a king. However, King Trent never played practical jokes, and permitted no tampering with his weapons. Someone had activated this sword, and sent it out to do mischief. That person would surely face formidable wrath of the king. That was little comfort to Bink at the moment, though. He didn't want to seem to hide behind the protection of the king. He wanted to fight his own battles and win. Except that he would have the same problem getting at a person who wasn't there. Except that he would have some problem getting at a person who wasn't there. As he considered, Bink rejected the notion that a distant person could be wielding this weapon. It was magically possible, but as far as he knew, he had no enemies. No one would want to attack him by magical or natural means, and no one would dare do it with the king's own sword, in the garden of Castle Rugner. Bink fenced with the enemy sword again, manoeuvred it into a vulnerable position, and sliced through the invisible arm. But no arm was there, of course. No doubt about it, the sword was wielding itself. He'd never actually fought one of these before, because the king didn't trust the judgment of the mindless weapon. So the experience was a novel one, and of course there was nothing inherently odd about it. Why not do battle with a charmed sword? Yet why should such a sword seek his life, assuming it was acting on its own? Bink had nothing but respect for the bladed weapons. He took good care of his own sword, making sure the sharpness charm was in good order, and never abusing the instrument. Swords of any type or creed should have no quarrel with him. Perhaps he'd inadvertently affronted this particular sword. "Sword, if I've caused you distress or wronged you, I apologize and prefer amends," he said. "I do not wish to fight you without reason." The sword cut ferociously at his leg. No quarter there. "At least tell me what your grievance is," Bink exclaimed, dancing away just in time. The sword continued its attack relentlessly. "I must put you out of commission," Bink said, with mixed regret, ire, and anticipation. Here was the real challenge. For the first time he took on full offensive posture, fencing the sword with skill. He knew he was a better man than it, but he could not strike down the wielder of the weapon, because there was none. Nobody to pierce, no hand to slice. The sword showed no sign of tiring. The magic powered it. How then could he overcome it? This was more of a challenge than he had supposed. Bink was not worried, because he found it hard to worry about a skill less than his own, yet if his opponent was invulnerable. Still, his talent wouldn't allow the sword to hurt him. A sword wielded by a man in ordinary fashion could do damage, because that was mundane. But when magic was involved, he was safe. In Xanth, hardly anything was completely unmagical, so he was extremely well protected. The question was he going to prevail honestly, by his own skill and courage, or by some fantastic-seeming coincidence? If he didn't do it the first way, his talent would do it the second. Again he manoeuvred the sword into a vulnerable position, and struck it across the flat of the blade, hoping to snap it off short. This didn't work. The metal was too strong. He had not really expected such a ploy to be effective. Strength was one of the basic charms built into modern swords. Well, what now? He heard the clop-clop of someone approaching. He had to wrap this up quickly, or suffer the embarrassment of being rescued. His talent didn't care about his pride, just his body. Bink found himself backed up against a tree, a real one. The hedge maze had been superimposed on existing vegetation, so that everything became part of the puzzle. This was a gluebark tree. Anything that penetrated the bark was magically stuck in it. Then the tree slowly grew around the object, absorbing it. Harmless so long as the bark was intact. Children could safely climb the trunk and play in its branches, as long as they didn't use cleats. Woodpeckers stayed well away from it. so Bink could lean against it, but had to be careful not to. The enemy sword slashed at his face. Bink was never sure afterwards whether his inspiration came before or after his action. Probably after, which meant his talent was in operation again, despite his efforts to avoid that. At any rate, instead of parrying this in time, he ducked. The sword passed over his head and smacked into the tree, slicing deeply into the bark. Instantly, the tree's magic focused. The blade's edge was sealed in place. It wrenched and struggled, but couldn't escape. Nothing could beat the specific magic of a thing in its own bailiwick. Bailiwick? It's a weird word. Bink was the victor. "Goodbye, sword," he said, sheathing his own weapon. "Sorry I couldn't visit longer." But behind his flippancy was a certain grim disquiet. Who or what had enacted the sword to slay him? He must, after all, have an enemy somewhere. He didn't like that. It wasn't so much any fear of attack, but a gut feeling of distress that he should be disliked to that extent by anyone, when he tried so hard to get along. He ducked around another corner, and smacked into a needle cactus. Not a real one, or he would have become a human pincushion, a mock needle cactus. The cactus reached down with its prickly branch, gripping Bink by the neck. "Clumsy oaf!" it snorted. "Do you wish me to petrify your ugly face in mud?" Bink recognised the voice and the grip. "Chester!" He rasped past the constriction in his neck. "Chester the centaur!" "Horseflies!" Chester swore. "You tricked me into giving myself away." He eased his terrible grip slightly. "But now you'd better tell me who you are, or I might squeeze you like this." And he squeezed, and Bink thought his head was going to pop off. Where was his talent now? "Fuck! Fuck!" Bink squeaked, trying to pronounce his own name, when his lips could not quite close. "Fuck!" "I do not stink," Chester said, becoming irritated that his grip tightened. "Not only homely, but not only are you homely as hell, you're impertinent." Then he did a double take. "Hey, you're wearing my face!" Bink had forgotten he was in costume. The centaur's surprise caused him to relax momentarily, and Bink snatched the opportunity. "I'm Bink, your friend and illusion in guise." Chester pondered. No centaur was stupid, but this one tended to think with his muscles. "If you're trying to fool me, remember Herman the Hermit, how I met him in the wilderness, saved Xanth from the Wiggle Swarm and the Will-o'-the-Wisp magic. Finest centaur of them all." Chester finally put Bink down. "Uncle Herman," he agreed, smiling. The effect was horrendous on the cactus face. "I guess you're okay. But what are you doing in my form?" "Same as you're doing in the cactus form," Bink said, massaging his throat. "Attending the masquerade ball." His neck didn't seem to be damaged, so his talent must have let this encounter be. "Ah, yes," fixing his needles eloquently. "The mischief of the good Queen Iris, the bitch sorceress. Have you found the way into the palace yet?" No, I ran into..." Bink wasn't sure he wanted to talk about the sword just yet. "A zombie." "Ah, zombie. Pity the poor oaf in that costume." A costume, of course! The zombie hadn't been real, it had mainly been another one of the Queen's illusions in costume. Bink had reacted as short-sightedly as Chester, fleeing it before discovering its identity and thereby encountering the sword, which certainly had not been either costume nor illusion. "Well, I don't much like the game anyway," he said. "I don't like the game either," Chester agreed. "But the prize, that is worth a year of my life." "By definition," Bink agreed. "One question answered by the good magician Humphrey. Free! But everyone's competing for it. Someone else will win." "Not if we get hoofing," Chester said. "Let's go unmask the zombie before it gets away." "Yeah," Bink said, embarrassed by his previous reaction. They passed the sword, still stuck in a tree. Finders keepers, Chester exclaimed happily, and put his hand around the sword. That's glue bark, it won't let go. But the centaur had already grasped the sword and yanked. Such was his strength that with a shower of bark and wood, but the sword didn't come free. Chester said. Look, tree, we have a glue bark in the centaur village. During the drought, I watered it every day and it survived. Now, all I ask for in return is the sword. That you have no use for. The sword came free. Chester tucked it into his quiver of arrows, fastening it in place with a loop of coil of rope he also carried, or so Bink guessed, observing the contortions of the cactus. Bink had put his own sword, Bink put a hand on his own sword, half fearing a renewal of hostilities, but the other weapon was quiet. Whatever had animated it was gone. Chester became aware of Bink's stare. You just have to understand trees, he said, moving on. It's true, of course, a centaur never lies. I did water that tree. It was more convenient than the toilet. So the glue bark had given up its prize. Well, why not? Centaurs were indeed generally kind to trees, though Chester had no particular love for needle cactuses, which was no doubt why the Queen, in her humour, had imposed this costume on him. They came to a place where Bink had encountered the zombie, but the awful thing was gone. Only a slimy chunk of dirt lay in the path. Chester nudged it with a forehoof. Real dirt. From a fake zombie? He inquired, puzzled. The Queen's illusions are getting better. Bink nodded in agreement. It was disquieting. Obviously the Queen had extended the illusion greatly, but why should she bother? Her magic was strong, far beyond the talents of ordinary people, for she was one of the 3 magician class citizens of Xanth. But it had to be a strain on even her to power and maintain every detail of every costume on every person attending the masquerade. Bink and Chester's costumes were visual only, as it would be difficult for them to converse. Here is a fresh pile of dirt, Chester remarked. Real dirt, not zombie dirt. He tapped it with a cactus foot, and nevertheless left a hoof print. Could the thing have gone back into the ground here? Curious, Bink scraped at the mound with his foot. There was nothing inside except more dirt. No zombie. Well, we lost him, Bink said, upset for a reason he could not quite fathom. The zombie had seemed so real. Let's just find a way out of this place instead of making fools of ourselves. Chester nodded, the cactus head wobbling ludicrously. I wasn't guessing people very well anyway, he admitted. And the only question I could ask the good magician doesn't have any good answer. No answer? Bink asked as they turned into another channel. Since Cherie had the colt, since Cherie had the colt, mind you, he's a fine little centaur, bushy-tailed. She doesn't seem to have much time for me anymore. It's like a 5th hoof around the stable. So, what can I... You too, Bink exclaimed, recognising the root of his own bad mood. Chameleon hasn't had ours yet, but... He shrugged. Don't worry, she won't have a colt. Blink choked, though it wasn't really funny. Fillies! Can't run with them. Can't run without them, said Chester dolefully. Suddenly, a harpy rounded the corner. There was another scramble to avoid collision. You blind in the beak, he demanded. Flap off, bird brain. You have a vegetable head, the harpy retorted, with a fluted tone. Clear out of my way before I sew you up in a stinking ball of your own dull needles. Dull needles? Chester, somewhat belligerent even in the best of moods, swelled up visibly in the affront. Had he actually been a cactus, he would have fired off a volley of needles immediately, and none of the darts would look dull. You want your grim feathers crammed up your snooty snoot? It was the harpy's turn to swell. Most of its breed were female, This one was male. More of the Queen's rather cutting humour, naturally. Oh, that's the harpy speaking. Naturally? The birdman fluttered. Rather after you've had a juice squeezed out of your pulp, green face. Oh, yeah, Chester demanded, forgetting that centaurs were not common brawlers. The harpy and the cactus squared off. The harpy was evidently a considerably larger creature. One that never had to take any gruff off strangers. That odd, half-musical note of speech. Manticora, Bink! Oh, Manticora, Blink explained. Exclaimed. The harpy paused. 1 point for you, centaur. Your voice sounds familiar, but... Startled, Bink reminded himself that he was in guise of centaur at the moment, so that it was himself, not Chester, the creature addressed. I'm Bink. I met you when I visited the good magician, way back when. Oh, yes, you broke the magic mirror. Fortunately, he had another one. Whatever came of you? I fell upon evil times, got married. The manticora laughed musically. Not to this cactus, I trust. Listen, thing, Chester said warningly. It's all right, my friend, Chester Centaur. Bink said quickly. He's the nephew of Herman the Hermit, who saved Xanth from the... I knew Herman, the manticora said. Greatest centaur there ever was, even before he gave his noble life for this country. Only one who I knew who wasn't ashamed of his magical talent. His will-o'-the-wisps led me out of a dragon warren once. When I learned of his death, I was so sad. I went out and strung a small tangle tree to death. He was so much better than those hoof-headed equines of the common herd who exiled him. He broke off. No offence, Cactus. You being his nephew and all, I may have a target to sting with you, but I would not affront the memory of that remarkable hermit. There was no surer route to Chester's favour than to praise his uncle hero, as perhaps the manticora knew. No offence, he said instantly. Everything you said is true. My people exiled Herman because they thought magic and a centaur was obscene. Most of them still do. Even my own filly, as nice and piece of the horseflesh as you'd care for. He shook his cactus head, becoming aware of his impropriety. They are hoofheads. Times are changing, the manticora said. One day all the centaurs will be flaunting their talent instead of flouting them. He made a gesture with his harpy wings. Well, I must go identify some more people. Not that I need the prize, it's merely a challenge. He moved on. Bink marvelled again at the humour of the Queen. To costume as a harpy such a formidable creature as a manticora, who possessed the head of a man, with triple jaws, body of a lion, wings of a dragon, tail of a monstrous scorpion, certainly one of the more deadly creatures in the land of Xanth, rendered into the likeness of the most disgusting. Yet the manticora was bearing up with grace, and playing the game of charades and costumes. Probably he felt secure in the knowledge that he had a soul, and so he cared little for appearances. And I will leave it there for today. Have a good one.